From the very beginning of her journey in Game of Thrones, Daenerys Targaryen's psychology is shaped by exile, trauma, and inherited mythology. Raised with the constant reminder that she is the last daughter of a fallen dynasty, her identity is constructed not around who she is, but around what she has lost. This early psychological framing plants the seeds of a powerful internal narrative that she is destined to reclaim what was stolen. Her sense of self becomes inseparable from the idea of restoration, revenge, and divine legitimacy. Her relationship with her brother Viserys reinforces the complex dynamic of humiliation and suppressed rage. Treated as a bargaining chip and reminded of her supposed weakness, Daenerys internalizes powerlessness before she ever wields authority. This prolonged exposure to domination shapes her early passivity, but also cultivates a deep psychological hunger for autonomy. When Viserys dies, it is not only a political turning point but a psychological emancipation from a narrative of subjugation. The marriage to Khal Drogo becomes another transformative psychological stage. What begins as coercion gradually shifts into mutual respect, and through this evolution Daenerys discovers influence through empathy and resilience rather than brute force. Her ability to adapt demonstrates a flexible intelligence that distinguishes her early leadership style. She begins to understand that power can be negotiated, embodied, and even inspired, not merely seized. The birth of her dragons represents a symbolic rebirth. Psychologically, they function as external manifestations of her emerging self-concept. Fire, survival, and miracle converge into a narrative of chosen destiny. From this point forward, Daenerys does not simply believe she has a claim to power. She believes she is power incarnate. The dragons become extensions of her will and confirmations of her exceptionalism. As she liberates the unsullied and frees enslaved populations, her identity fuses with the role of savior. Each victory reinforces a moral framework in which she is both conqueror and redeemer. This duality strengthens her conviction that her authority is ethically superior to that of traditional rulers. The gratitude of the freed solidifies her self-image as a breaker of chains, making it psychologically difficult for her to later perceive dissent as legitimate disagreement. Her time ruling in Meereen exposes the first cracks in her idealism. Governing proves far more complex than conquering. Here, the psychology of power begins to shift from inspirational leadership to anxious control. Faced with insurgency and betrayal, Daenerys confronts the limits of benevolence. Her frustration reveals the tension between her desire to be loved and her expectation to be obeyed. Isolation plays a significant role in the consolidation of her authority. Surrounded increasingly by advisors who affirm her destiny, she becomes less exposed to perspectives that challenge her worldview. The psychological phenomenon of echo chambers reinforces her belief in her moral infallibility. Over time, disagreement feels less like counsel and more like treason. Her repeated survival through fire strengthens a quasi-messianic self-perception. When a leader begins to interpret survival as proof of righteousness, criticism loses its grounding. Daenerys increasingly interprets events through a lens of prophecy and inevitability. This mindset narrows her tolerance for compromise, as compromise implies doubt in destiny. Loss further radicalizes her psychology. The deaths of Drogo, her unborn child, loyal advisors, and later her dragons compound unresolved grief. Rather than processing these traumas, she channels them into renewed commitment to conquest. Power becomes not only ambition but coping mechanism. The throne transforms into a psychological anchor against vulnerability. By the time she sails toward Westeros, her identity is fully intertwined with conquest and moral certainty. The girl who once sought safety now embodies a ruler who equates resistance with injustice. The psychological journey from victim to liberator to conqueror reveals how power, once internalized as destiny, reshapes empathy into judgment and conviction into absolutism. When Daenerys finally reaches Westeros, she encounters a cultural resistance unlike the gratitude she experienced in Essos. The people do not see her as a liberator, but as a foreign invader with dragons. This psychological dissonance destabilizes her self-concept. If she is not universally welcomed, then the narrative of destined salvation begins to fracture. Her interactions in the North intensify her insecurity. Accustomed to adoration, she now faces suspicion and emotional distance. The contrast between her reception and the loyalty inspired by Jon Snow threatens her need for affirmation. Psychologically, this introduces jealousy and fear of displacement, emotions that clash with her self-image as rightful queen. The execution of the Tarlys marks a pivotal shift toward authoritarian rigidity. In this moment, she chooses fear over persuasion. What she frames as justice increasingly resembles coercion. Her belief that she alone understands what is good for the realm justifies extreme measures. The psychology of moral absolutism becomes more visible. The loss of trusted advisors like Jorah Mormont and Missandei intensifies her isolation. Without grounding influences, her inner circle shrinks to fewer dissenting voices. Grief merges with paranoia, and her reliance on the dragons as instruments of certainty grows stronger. Emotional pain begins translating directly into political severity. When Missandei is executed, the event crystallizes her transformation. The personal becomes political in the most destructive way. Rather than channeling grief into strategic patience, she embraces annihilation as moral response. The idea that mercy leads to weakness solidifies in her mind. Her earlier identity as breaker of chains becomes overshadowed by avenger. The destruction of King's Landing reveals the culmination of her psychological evolution. Even after the city surrenders, she continues the assault. This moment is not impulsive madness, but the logical extreme of her internal narrative. If she is destiny, then resistance, past or future, must be eradicated completely. Fear becomes the ultimate guarantee of order. Her actions reflect a classic dynamic described in political psychology. When leaders conflate personal trauma with collective justice, they rationalize disproportionate violence. Daenerys does not perceive herself as cruel. She perceives herself as necessary. The tragedy lies in her inability to separate moral vision from personal pain. Power has progressively reduced her capacity for empathy toward those who challenge her. Early compassion becomes conditional upon loyalty. Anyone outside her vision of the new world is positioned as obstacle rather than human being. This cognitive narrowing is a hallmark of authoritarian consolidation. In her final conversations, she speaks not of domination, but of liberation on a global scale. Yet her language reveals an inability to tolerate disagreement. She imagines reshaping the world entirely according to her convictions. The psychological certainty that once empowered her now eliminates space for pluralism. Daenerys Targaryen's arc ultimately demonstrates how power amplifies unresolved wounds. Her initial desire to free the oppressed evolves into an uncompromising mission that justifies destruction. The psychology of her rise and fall illustrates a timeless truth. When identity fuses completely with destiny and authority, power ceases to be a tool and becomes an unquestionable self-justification. In the final stage of her arc in Game of Thrones, Daenerys Targaryen embodies a profound psychological paradox. The liberator who becomes a symbol of domination. Her rhetoric remains anchored in freedom, yet her methods increasingly depend on fear and total control. This contradiction does not emerge suddenly, but represents the culmination of a long internal evolution in which moral conviction gradually eclipses moral reflection. She no longer questions whether her actions are just. She assumes justice is inherent in her will. After the fall of King's Landing, her speech to the Unsullied and Dothraki reveals the final consolidation of her worldview. She speaks of freeing the entire world, expanding her mission beyond Westeros to a global scale. Psychologically, this expansion signals an escalation from reclaiming a throne to reshaping civilization itself. Her ambition is no longer personal restoration, but ideological transformation. In her mind, opposition anywhere becomes oppression everywhere. A key element of her psychology at this stage is cognitive closure. Having endured betrayal, loss, and isolation, Daenerys gravitates toward absolute certainty as protection against vulnerability. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. If earlier seasons showed her wrestling with doubt, the final moments depict a leader who has eliminated internal conflict entirely. Certainty provides emotional stability, even as it produces political catastrophe. Her relationship with Jon Snow in the final episodes underscores her inability to distinguish love from loyalty. When she asks him to see the world as she does, she is not inviting dialogue but demanding alignment. The psychological need for validation merges with the need for obedience. For Daenerys, unity must be ideological and unconditional. Any deviation threatens both her authority and her identity. The Iron Throne itself functions as a powerful psychological symbol. Throughout her journey, it represents justice, belonging, and destiny. Yet when she finally stands before it, the moment is quiet and almost reverent, suggesting that the throne is less a seat of governance and more an object of lifelong fixation. The throne has absorbed her grief, ambition, and sense of purpose. It is the physical embodiment of her narrative. What makes her tragedy psychologically compelling is that she never perceives herself as tyrannical. From her perspective, she is correcting systemic injustice on a massive scale. The destruction she causes is framed internally as a painful but necessary cleansing. This moral reframing illustrates how easily noble intentions can justify extreme measures when filtered through personal trauma and unchecked authority. Her increasing detachment from the suffering she causes reflects emotional numbing rather than sadism. Repeated exposure to violence, combined with immense responsibility, has altered her emotional responses. The empathy that once defined her interactions with the oppressed becomes abstract and ideological. She cares about the people in theory, but individual lives lose salience in the pursuit of a transformed world. The culmination of her arc suggests that power magnifies underlying psychological structures, rather than creating new ones. Daenerys always possessed intensity, conviction, and a belief in destiny. What changes is the scale at which those traits operate. With dragons and armies, her inner narrative acquires catastrophic reach. The tragedy lies not in sudden madness, but in the logical extension of deeply rooted beliefs. Her final moments reveal a lingering vulnerability beneath the armor of certainty. In private, her tone softens, and her vision of the future sounds almost hopeful. She imagines a better world free from cruelty. Yet this imagined future allows no room for disagreement about what better means. Her psychological blind spot remains intact until the very end. Ultimately, Daenerys Targaryen's story serves as a meditation on the fragile boundary between revolutionary and ruler. The psychology of power in her character demonstrates how liberation can transform into domination when destiny overrides dialogue. Her fall is not merely political but existential, showing how a leader who becomes inseparable from her mission risks losing the very humanity that once made her worthy of loyalty.